it's very important to understand what life's trials and tribulations actually teach us. I'm going to describe a few of mine in this video, keeping with recent videos where I've explained some of my background, so check this out. So I've made a couple videos recently in the spirit of Jupiter moving into Scorpio, which, as I've said, that really is a time to open up some of our deeper, vulnerabilities and stresses and fears, and resurrect a level of compassion and forgiveness for people in our life that have hurt us, and why we would do that, how we can do that, what we can really learn. And I appreciate a lot of the comments that people have left, how much it's been helpful, not just to hear my story, but to connect and to link up with examples that you would perhaps have in your life. And, I want to say a few things first, and then I want to explain some literal lessons that I learned, and not just lessons that I learned, but the difficulty as well. And you'll see how they're really contained in the same event. It's just a choice that we have. And these choices are literally what you would say like a karmic choice. I'll get to that in a minute. But first, what I wanted to say was that I don't want to create the idea or the illusion that this resurrection of, our past and, being able to forgive people of difficulty that has happened, that this is, something that's easy, or even something that's, neat and buttoned up like, oh, I forgave you, now I'm happy. This is not easy stuff. This is some of the hardest stuff we do. And, I spoke about it in the last video that the reason to do it is not because we get anything, or it's not for the other person. We're not doing someone a favor by forgiveness. In fact, forgiveness itself is a byproduct of your spiritual growth and your capacity to see things correctly and to see things with discrimination. What I mean to say is that the reason anyone has power over you, because this is why we're afraid to stay engaged, is because you have this illusion that they can give you something, that they're here to give you something, and that you can get something from them that'll be helpful, or they should have given you something rather than what they did give you, so to speak. That's a very crude way to say it, but especially like if we talk about family members. We put them on a pedestal and we elevate them to this sort of icon. Well, you were my father, you were supposed to this or that, or my mother, and we put them on a pedestal from which they have nowhere to go but down. Now again, we can say, well, my father was horrible, but my mother was great, so why couldn't my father be like my mother, or whatever it is. That's not the way to think about it, in my opinion. In my opinion, the way to think about it is those people who showed up with, pain, and who hurt us, and who projected that pain onto us and created this antagonistic relationship with us that we now carry forward. They taught us something different than those who showed up with love and compassion. And often it's mixed, because the ones that have love and compassion at times also have frustration and anger. We're all a mix, and that includes you. You have parts of you that are beautiful and that are compassionate and that are infinitely wise. And then there are parts of you that's like a monster, and everybody tries to tolerate it, and you are also abusive and cruel and nasty, or have been at times, and you're doing your best with that. Other people are doing their best as well. But I want to also make a distinction, and I want to talk about even specifically with the examples like in my life. In the examples that I used, what I talk mainly about, like the separation from my father. There was also distance from my mother, at least emotional distance. When I talk about forgiveness, it was very much an internal thing. And I spoke about it correctly, but I understand how it could be confused. I didn't say that that some kind of behavior or some kind of closeness with them was reestablished. Like, oh, now I forgive you. Now let's hang out and have Thanksgiving dinner. And now I'm calling you all the time and I'm engaged in your life and I'm just as intimate as I was when we were children, or that you would like me to be, or anything. No. In many ways, that intimacy was broken to some extent. It was broken. And there was another level, there was another bond that formed. But the bond that formed with both of my parents, I did state this, but I'll state it more intentionally. The bond that did wind up forming with both of my parents was a bond where I knew who I was dealing with, and I knew the potential for potential, abuse and things getting out of control. And, keeping my distance, so to speak, was certainly part of it. Now, you might say, well, but that doesn't sound like forgiveness. It sounds like you're still carrying stuff around or whatever. It's not. You don't have to perform or behave for someone else. Again, if these kinds of confusions are sort of beset in your mind, it's because you're not established in yourself. Now, let me be very clear. I'm not saying that my parents were necessarily so happy with where I landed with it. They would have probably liked to spend more time with me. In fact, I know they would have. But I didn't want to. And I felt I wouldn't say zero guilt, but for the most part, I didn't feel any guilt. I didn't feel like I didn't owe them an explanation. I never offered one. They never asked for one. For the most part, it diffused all of the tension, because after I had a separation from my father, for example, when I started visiting again and whatnot, there were a couple times when things erupted. And when they did, I would just kind of leave. And after that happening a couple times, he realized, well, I can't really treat Sam like that. So he stopped doing it. It was a boundary. It only takes one person in a relationship to have a good boundary, and then both people will honor the boundary. If they want to have the relationship, or they won't have a relationship. And I was ready to walk away from the relationship, and in fact I did. When those things exploded a couple times, I would just walk out and be like, just kind of leave, and not even having a plan in my mind when I would hang out again with him, if I was going to. I didn't know. Was just living spontaneously, and then I'd be like, I think I'll, drive over and see the old man. And then it would just be fine. What I'm saying is this. It was an internal thing where I made peace with myself, with my relationship with them. And I did explain it this way, but what wasn't clear is that it's really quite unconventional. Again, I did use the example of, like, with my chart, I have Gemini and I have a whole bunch of planets there, and Sun Rahu and all kinds of stuff. So it certainly wasn't conventional. Like, for instance, I never bought people Christmas presents or any of that stuff. I just didn't do it. But I had to be true to myself. And at some point, that's just what happened. When I woke up to a lot of, and a lot of that got put into perspective, I I didn't care what they thought. I wasn't doing anything for their approval. And it was only from that point of view, when I didn't need anything from them, that I could truly see them and truly love them and truly appreciate them. Because they're not representing some failed, monolithic institution. They didn't represent that anymore. You weren't my father who did this to my mother and did this to me. You're a guy who tried his best. And I could approach that with empathy. And I could say, wow, I don't know how I would have handled that. And I could feel clear in remembering the good and appreciating the good. But the boundaries were always there. The reality of the situation is there was a deep fracture in this lifetime between me and my parents and my birth family. And it's similar with my sister. I'm in many ways, I'm very close with my sister. We don't really talk that much, though. We're very independent. But I love my sister immensely. She loves me too. My mother loved me so much. I love my mother so much. Even though we didn't see each other that much. Love is in the heart. And it doesn't need to be, everyone's style and model of relating and interacting is different. And anyone who knows me well, who is intimate with me, friendly or relationship-wise or family-wise, they know that they get the real thing. They know I'm honest, I'm real, and it's expressed that way. Maybe it's not expressed as much as they would like, and all those other things. But the point of the matter is that kind of inner forgiveness and that compassion doesn't have to look the way you think it might look. You don't have to be burdened with, well, it's not that easy to forgive people because you don't want to let them into your life. Right. You don't have to let them into your life like they might want, or succumb to the pressure of what it means to get back into some kind of arrangement. That's separate from the idea. And what I said earlier, I'll just say it again now. If that's what you're thinking I'm talking about, it's not. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about you go forgive them and now get back into some whatever. No. Forgiveness and letting go and being detached literally means when I say that it's for you, it's so that you can heal, so that those hooks are not destroying your sanity or your mind, or you're not hanging on to it. It allows that space so that you can be clear. You're not doing anyone a favor by, quote, forgiving them. You're unhooking the control they actually have over you. And again, this is why this is all Scorpio kind of energy. The anger and the charge and the righteousness that boils up is where you're vulnerable. You're vulnerable to anything that can control you so much on that level. So this is the complexity. It's complex. And again, this is the difficult motivation of Scorpio. The powerful motivation of Scorpio is it's where we hang on, where we want to keep trying to work it out, where we don't just give up because it's hard, where it's worth it for us to try to stay engaged with that thing that we love. Again, because it's that fixed water, those feelings that don't change, or they don't change easily. It's literally fixed water. You have Cancer, which is cardinal water, where we initiate feeling. Pisces is mutable water, where feelings are flowing. Scorpio is fixed water, and it's often where we get stuck in our emotions. We're emotionally stuck. And we're afraid to let something in that we're going to really love, because what happens if I let this thing in and I really love it, and I let myself really love, then what happens? Because it's not going to change that easily. What if you stop loving me? Or what if you start hurting me and I still love you? Then what? Then I'm in a terrible position. This is the vulnerability of Scorpio. The power is in that resiliency of love to be so devotional and to be devoted to something higher. And again, this is why the big part of what I discussed in the last video was the devotion and the spiritual practice and the connection to that thing that's beyond all of the attachment to the world. Because let's face it, you have attachment to the family that hurt you and this and that. And when your identity is wrapped up in that, in these limited beings, you as a limited being, when you think this is me and this stuff that happened to me, I'm the one and I feel this and I'm, when it all revolves around the ego, that's called the ego. Again, we have to understand these terms. The ego doesn't mean, this big ego. It means that separate self, that separate identity that places itself as the most important thing in its own world. Right? When it's certainly not. Existence is ambivalent toward you and your ego. There's nothing wrong with that. You're the most important thing in your life, but you're not the most important thing in anyone else's life. You're actually not. You might come close with some people, even like your parents and your lovers and whatnot. Everyone's living for their own actualization. And again, when we think that we're this separate being, then we keep trying to get everything to focus back toward that. And we're looking for evidence and clues that, do you still love me? Am I still important? And we just wind up disappointed because the painful reality is everyone is in their own world. But again, when we know the true nature of the self, or we're at least aspiring, we're not self-realized yet, but we at least understand this concept, and then we start to unwind all of that attachment to this lower identity. Then we can have some space to start to move and to put other things into perspective, and the perspective that says, I understand that you are just doing your best, some person who hurt you, and I give you permission to be the flawed human being that I am. And that doesn't mean that we have to get back into this thing that we were in that was so dysfunctional and painful, but it means that something changes in you where you're clear in it. And so, I had those feelings for my parents, and, I'd say it's easier to describe it with my father, but, throughout our life, we would still have conversations, and it was hard. It's still hard. There's still a big disconnect. He was still the way he was. And I didn't have the same charge around all the stuff that drove him in his life. And so the relationship was still what it is, and then after a certain period of time, it just didn't really work so much anymore. So this is one of the things that I wanted to express, because there was quite a there was quite a lot of commentary, and that was one of the prevailing things that I saw, is people saying, well, yeah, it's great to do that, but it's really hard, especially when someone has hurt you, to trust them again, to get back into all that. Forgiveness and trust are different things. So you're excused for not trusting them, but when there's actual forgiveness, all of that takes care of itself. So, you don't struggle with it. That's why I said, if you're worried about that part of the equation, you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. Because authentic forgiveness flows from compassion and love and spiritual growth, spiritual awareness. And once that authentic spiritual growth and awareness and identity comes, forgiveness just happens. Like I said, I didn't consciously forgive my parents or anything like that. I started doing meditation, and I started connecting to the truth. And from that place of truth, I saw, okay, that's what happened. Because none of us want to walk around hating anybody. It's hard. So when there's authentic forgiveness, there will also be authentic boundaries. You And you'll feel okay establishing them. You'll feel fine saying, hey, it's great to see you. And then when they start to want to invade the boundary, be like, well, I don't know. I think I'm going to go now. And you hold that without guilt and shame and all the stuff that they might have used before when you were in that kind of with them. Those hooks aren't there. Or they're not there as much. Again, you don't have to go all the way. So, pulling out a few of the hooks is a good place to start, right? But again, this is a lot of what we're going to be dealing with as Jupiter goes through Scorpio, is really looking at that past pain, trauma, vulnerability, stress, fear. And there's a great opportunity to really learn a lot about ourselves from it and, unwind those stories and dramas toward greater devotion and compassion. And so I wanted to talk about, also, and invite others to also talk about what specifically have you learned through different, let's say, traumas or bad experiences. Mine are very typical. I don't consider them to be unusual. Talking about them it's not a big deal. A father that hits their son, boy, welcome to the 70s, or whatever. Welcome to being a young man. Most men or boys were hit when they were growing up. And so it's certainly not the unusual tale, and you just deal with it. It went further than that. We'll just leave it there. And the few instances of pretty severe traumatic abuse, more than just a smack are what really compelled my mother back then to get a separation, because this happened in the early 70s when women really weren't even separating from their husbands yet. My mother was a courageous woman. Now, my father was hitting her. You want to subscribe, but even if you are subscribed, you want to click this little bell that says get notified about every new video. You want to click that, and then you will be notified, and it has the little ringer on after you do that. So make sure to... But once he started to hit me really badly, and I mean stuff that you'd go to jail for, this day, belts and leaving marks and can't sit down. And once that started happening a few times, she decided to, have a separation. And at this time, she didn't drive. She didn't have a job. She was basically cloistered. And all the stuff you hear in the Me Too movement now about how women are controlled and exploited and dominated and don't have any power. This was early 1970s, 1972. It was really like that. Again, my mother had a high school education, had 2 kids. My mother wasn't even less than 20 years older than me, 19 years older than my sister. Right, so 19 and 20, and she wound up, getting her driver's license on the sly, and even got a job at like a 7-Eleven, and then told my father, I want a separation, which was a dangerous move too, the way he had acted. But she didn't want to have the family raised by him as bad, because he started getting so much worse, particularly so much more abusive toward me. I thank my lucky stars every day that my mom was the badass that she was to do that. As much as it was wrenching, because then parents split up and the family's blown apart. She knew, no telling what would have happened if I'd had to grow up with that kind of ongoing abuse. But what I wanted to say is that when you're like whipped, abused, held down, and beaten, like it teaches you some life lessons that are very hard to overcome, but also very profound on a spiritual level. And of course, one of the things, and again, I think all victims of abuse one of the first things that you learn, or how it really conditions your mind, is powerlessness. It's a hard one. It's hard to feel powerless, to be conditioned that you're powerless when something or someone holds you down and, again, inflicts pain on you, or like in the case of rape or something, violates you. It's a violation to get beaten while someone bigger is holding you down. It shows you that it can give you the idea that you're powerless, and that it'll never happen. Like, well, that's sort of the next phase, but it also brings this terror, this fear of death, and this terror, because when that's happening, and these images are seared into my mind. And I'm not talking about just getting smacked or hit, which is another level. I'm talking about, it's basically kind of like torture. You hold someone down and you like whip them. It's, aside from physical pain, the powerlessness is really, it's hard to categorize, except you feel like you're going to die. Like, you just don't really know. Pain is an indicator that this should stop, right? And when pain just keeps happening, another hit and hit and hit. I think there were like 10, 15 hits of a belt. You're screaming in pain. That's the fear of death. That's so traumatic that your fight or flight gets activated. And so you can carry this around for a long time, and again, maybe your whole life. But it also gives this resistance, this thing to push against. And it teaches you something that's also true, which is you're not in control. You're going to die. It teaches both. And whether or not you learn that more subtle lesson, which is also a lesson that we all need to learn, I don't care who you are, you need to learn that lesson. You are not in control. Excuse me. I don't have any water here. You are vulnerable. You're vulnerable. You're not in control. You're going to die. Something bigger than you could at any time end it for you, or inflict pain on you, and that's the end of it. We're all maybe 10 seconds from some painful moment of it's actually true. Now, that awareness and the ability to see that way takes a long time, obviously. But this kind of life lesson is also part of the blessing. And again, this is not putting a lipstick on a pig or a happy face on something. Oh well, at least I got to learn really early that I might die at any moment. You know what? That's actually a really good lesson to learn really early. And I'm glad that I did, because one of the things that happens is after those kinds of things, if you can manage the trauma and you can unwind the anger and frustration and the powerlessness and the negative quality of it, which is not easy, I'm not saying it's easy, but if you can understand that there was a higher purpose to it, even as you're working on the negative part, and you can see and understand that there was a purpose for this, and that these people weren't just monsters, and feel compassion even for them, because underneath it all, they they have to feel worse about it than I do now, because it happened to me 15 years ago, but they actually did it. And to see how much damage maybe it had done, or a deep regret like that, and you get a perspective, then you learn to be very thankful that those things happened. And of course, the residual problems and pain is a residual problem and pain. But again, everyone has a story. Everyone has some version of that. I hear the versions of that other people had. I mean, I do readings all the time, so I hear people's stories. I don't know how they got through it. I don't know how people got through the stories that they got through. I could tell my stories and people, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but people would be like, good Lord, how in the world did you ever, like, just not have that, dominate your whole life? But our souls are heroic. We come here on a heroic journey. If we approach it that way. Or we come here like a worm. Swami Shivananda, one of my favorite statements ever, Swami Shivananda says, roar like a lion of Vedanta. Don't say, oh, my karma, my karma, my karma. Roar like a lion of Vedanta. And then another one is, don't die here like a worm. Assert the self. Say mantra japa. Do meditation. These kinds of things. This is why Swami Shivananda was so amazing. He spoke to that big part in us that's not just this little weak creature who is like, oh, but I was treated badly. Yes, I get it. We all were. And we take it so personally. But that's why you were born. Not only were you born, but you were born in a time where you, and with some kind of means to be able to ponder your existence. So every negative, you can flip the negative and the problem of the negative toward the positive of the negative as well. Yes, you learn powerlessness. It's crushing to the ego. It crushes the ego. In some ways, it's better to get the ego crushed really early because you become resilient. You don't have any delusions. You become sensitive to suffering, to others who suffer. You have to be compassionate or you will stay stuck. And the same problem is the great lesson, or is also the great redemption. You learn that you're powerless, but you are powerless. You learn that you're not in control, but you're not in control. Now again, where it can be really, really damaging is when we start to perpetrate the negative behavior, because we learn what can happen, and what did happen when I was younger too, with some of the frustration, is we then start to act out. What happens is powerlessness and anger and hostility creates frustration that we then want to start to act out, and this is why these can create legacies of abuse. Families that abuse each other for generation after generation after generation. And the big confusion I had when I was growing up was I didn't know if I was going to turn out like that. And until I did, I was still angry at my father. And I actually got the chronology wrong. I remember it in the video. It was actually after I had my first real deep relationship where I was almost going to get married, and it was after that, and I went through the real difficult time with this girl, and I was maybe 22, 23, when that broke up. After that was finished, that pain and the difficulty and literally looking my future in the face, because I was programmed to kind of do the same thing. We're programmed, man. It's like this karmic program that we're sort of following. I was programmed to meet some girl who was damaged and get involved with her, and her mental problems would have frustrated me to the point to where I'm hitting her too and all this stuff. Having kids, this girl wanted nothing more than to just have my kids and get married, and she wouldn't take her birth control pills. I mean, she wanted to get pregnant and married. like 20, 21 years old. That's what she wanted to do. I didn't. That's what she wanted to do. And she was crazy, and she would push me around and like dying for me to like hit her. Because she grew up, her father hit her, and she had all these brothers, and it was just, I was just programmed to go down this like redneck drama. That's what I was raised in. That's literally what I was raised in. And I was marching down the path. It's crazy. And I was like, no. I had started meditating by then for sure, but I could see it. I could see it. I'm just like, I will say it's the hardest thing I ever did. The hardest thing I ever did was not doing that, because of course I loved her so much. It's crazy. Pined away over her for like a year, and then finally we went out, and it was like just, oh God, it was sick. Found her on Facebook. I didn't contact her, but I was like, okay, I made the right choice. It all worked out for her and me. No complaints. But I was programmed to go down that path. And it wasn't until I went through that and saw that part of my potential that, and then had to get out of that and release that, and that I was really clear, especially of the anger karma around my father. Because I didn't really know what I was left with. I really wasn't angry at him or hate him in the interim between like becoming, like learning how to meditate and then playing in bands and hanging out with this girl and all that. I wasn't still really angry, but I wasn't really wanting to be influenced. But it was after I learned enough about myself to realize that I'm not also going to grow up and like hit women, and because that's what I was afraid of when I was younger, to be honest with you, because that's what I saw. And I didn't want to by any means. It's not like I had the tendency, and I never did, or never even felt the urge to do that with girlfriends or anything like that. It's just never been. I mean, I've not even hardly been in any fights in my life, which is remarkable considering what a real pain in the neck I can be and how much intensity I can be. It's never gotten to fights. I've always known how to avoid that. I've never wanted to hit anybody or anything like that. But after that episode unraveled, then I could, it's kind of like I felt, that's really when the sort of real confusion about what I actually got from him left, because that was the kind of fear that was still there that I didn't really know. So on that on that extremely visceral level, it was easier to have that sort of space to move and not to be triggered. But the point about this is that some of the deepest suffering that you've had, and those who have brought that upon you, have also gifted you with the greatest opportunities to grow. And again, I want to reiterate, it doesn't mean that having unraveled some compassion or whatever means you have to be involved with them again. Absolutely not. No way. They're not correlated at all. It's not an outer thing. Like I said, it's an inner thing. You forgive them in your heart because you get the perspective, because you just don't feel the thing anymore. It has nothing to do with hanging out with them again so they could abuse you or whatever it might be or whatever. The biggest things to understand is any place where we want or need something or are craving something from someone, like you need to give me attention or I'm going to feel this or that or this kind of thing, our whole path to our true self is then arrested and hijacked at that level, and we're going to be abusive. So you want to look at this as well, big time, because it's not just what people have done to you, it's what you do as well. And Scorpio is this emotional pressure that we can put on people. Think of the people where you want their attention, you want something from them, and when they don't give it, or they don't give it the way you want, you say something or you get cranky or passive-aggressive, undercutting, use words and situations to manipulate them and try to extract some kind of thing to keep control of the situation. We all do it, but you do it too. And you pay a price for it, because when you do that, you also undermine their trust in you. And this is the thing that we all need to learn. It's stereotypical to say it, but it's also stereotypically true that men can be more aggressive. Women can tend to be more passive aggressive. It's just masculine and feminine energy. Scorpio is definitely a sign of passive aggressive. It's literally, almost literally passive, which is water, female, aggressive, which is Mars. Mars is the ruler of Scorpio. External Mars is Aries and action. Internal, reflective, emotional Mars is like passive aggressive. And it's easy to think that we don't pay a price when we coerce and manipulate, or when we pout and do all this kind of stuff. But we do, because someone then stops wanting to interact with us or give us as much in return. And these are all learned behaviors where we've learned to navigate this kind of, potential for getting hurt and things like that. So you want to keep that in mind as well. But I wanted to make this video here to kind of at least put a kind of bow on the, if it's a bow, but on the conversation about what you really learn. And put in the comments, share how the deepest pain and difficulty that you've gone through is also like directly transferable to the greatest lessons that you've learned. And there's some of the deepest. And I can say very assuredly, like in my example, those things that I took from it, that powerlessness and that things being out of control and whatnot, it's inspired me to be empowered, to empower others, to give others a feeling of control, to also remind them the truth that they're not in control, and all these things that you might see me do all the time. A lot of it started at that very early awakening. Most of our very early memories are traumatic ones for a reason. It's like the light kind of switches on. Most of our earliest memories aren't the birthday party where we were blowing out the candles. It was dad holding you down and beating you. You're like, oh Christ, now I'm alive. And it hardwires that survival instinct into the reptile brain. You've heard me talk about the three brains before. The reptile brain, that survival brain, it wires those experiences into that deep sort of cortex, into that deep, R complex. And it's like, welcome to this life. So those things really shape a lot of the experiences that come later. And what you took from them in the negative is also the catalyst for the positive and of the greatness that you're capable of. So we'll leave it at that. And, share your experiences if you want. Of course, if you don't, then you don't have to. But, it's an interesting exercise to see how the things that hurt you the most also taught you the greatest lessons. It might also be an easy way to unwind things you're hanging on to. And you also want to remember that forgiveness and all of these things I'm talking about, they don't have to have an external form. You can forgive someone and never speak to them again. That's fine too, whatever it looks like. It doesn't mean that you get engaged in some kind of activity again. It's an internal releasing and liberation. Because you'll never be liberated of the karma of this world when you're hanging on to anger and righteousness about the pain that's been caused from the past. The past is over. It is literally over. So to be able to move freely in that could be a great healing lesson. And I hope this has helped you to hear some of, some of my story.